If you're a fan of trains, you're probably familiar with steam locomotives. And depending on the era, most people picture one burning either wood or coal. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the classic image of a fireman working a shovel. But there are some steam engines that didn't use coal or wood. Instead, they used oil. But why did they do this? I'll tell you all about it on this episode of Railroads Explained.
Train, train, train. I've got a thing about trains.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Railroads Explained. I'm Tim the Train Guy, and today we're talking about oil burners. Steam locomotives, that is. Now, if, like me, you're a fan of the Southern Pacific or the Santa Fe, you're probably already somewhat familiar with them, as they were both very prominent users of oil-burning steam locomotives. Oil-firing setups work by having heavy fuel oil forced through a nozzle by air or steam pressure, where it is then atomized into a mist and burned to heat the boiler. The fireman would then control the oil pressure and, of course, the temperature with a valve. The first patents for these setups began showing up in the 1860s, and they were first used on ships. The first oil-fired locomotive example was built in Russia in 1874. In 1893, the Great Eastern Railway of Great Britain also began using oil burners. They were meant to burn waste oil that would have otherwise gone into the rivers. The first American oil-fired steam locomotives were built for the Southern Pacific, and they seemed to want them for a very specific reason. You see, the Southern Pacific Railroad primarily operated in the Southwest and up the Pacific coast of the United States. And there's really not much coal in this region. There is, however, a lot of oil, with places like Texas being well known for their oil production. Even California at one point had a thriving oil industry. Other railroads in the region, like the Santa Fe, the Western Pacific, and the Texas and Pacific, would also extensively use oil burners for similar reasons. The presence of oil in this region is also why these railroads were among the first to dieselize, with Santa Fe being first and Western Pacific being second. Just as a quick side note, getting back to the steam locomotives, the Southern Pacific Railroad had designed cab-forward steam engines that burned oil, because otherwise the engineer and fireman would have to be at opposite ends of the locomotive. Australia also used many oil-fired steam locomotives as well. Though oil-fired steam locomotives did have their advantages, they were not without their drawbacks. They were more difficult to get started because they needed air or steam pressure to get the oil going to the burner, and that often had to be supplied from an external source during cold starts. Additionally, they often used what's called bunker fuel, or heavy fuel oil. It's essentially what's left of crude oil after you refine out all the gasoline, diesel, and whatever else. It has roughly the consistency of tar, and fuel systems that use it have to employ an oil heater in order to keep it liquid enough to flow through the pipes. It's also notoriously dirty and often contains sulfur and various heavy metals. And often it was only used because it was dirt cheap. However, in the era of preservation, most oil burners will use recycled cooking oil as a cleaner alternative. On the topic of preservation, many steam locomotives that once burned coal have been converted to oil firing for environmental reasons. One rather notorious example of this is the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railway in Colorado. In June of 2018, a forest fire broke out near Durango, Colorado. Investigators later determined that the cause of the fire was coal cinders from one of the Durango and Silverton's steam locomotives, and their entire operable steam fleet was converted to oil firing shortly afterwards. The famous Union Pacific Big Boy number 4014 was also converted to oil firing during its restoration, which again was done for environmental reasons. Although such decisions have been met with some controversy from rail fans, with critics saying that they're changing the design of the locomotive and therefore it's not the same anymore. However, and this is just my opinion, if that's what's necessary to keep these engines running, I personally don't see a problem with it. Though I'll be interested to see what you guys think about it in the comments. But whatever the case, oil-fired steam locomotives have definitely left their mark in railroad history books. And with that, as always, thank you all for watching. I'm Tim the Train Guy, and I'll see you in the next one.